Welcome to bread baking with me. All right, yay! All right, get a little dry there. So today, what we're gonna do today is I'm gonna start showing you in stages. And I'm not gonna show you the dough making stage first, just because in order for me to get this into stages, I had some dough that I made. I split that, and I'll talk about that when we get to the talking about the big batch, which is what I usually do, because who needs just one loaf of bread at a time? Not me, I don't know about y'all. So I'm gonna bake one, and right before I put that in the oven, I'm gonna show you how I shape it. Understand that you could do it different ways. I'm gonna show you how I do it, because that's the little bit more complicated way. You'll know from what I've given you in writing about what to do. So I have bought these baskets a while ago. They're called bannetons. And when you buy a loaf of bread, like artisan bread somewhere, and there's flour rings on the top, that's where this comes from. So you can see that there's flour in the basket. That's because I never wash this thing. So what happens is you coat it with flour the first time or two, and what I did was I just spritzed it with water, not oil, because I didn't want to ruin this. So I spritzed it with water the first time, and I put flour in there, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. And this is how I get it ready for shaping, because most of the time now I'm baking those freeform loaves like what I brought, and that's because it rises in this, and then when it goes in the oven, I invert this onto my baking surface, and that's why the rings are on the top of the bread. Okay, so I'll show you this way. So here's how I prepare my basket. Yes, ma'am.
Where do we get those?
Oh, thank you. And ask questions anytime, please. I happen to order these on Amazon.
Okay.
It's spelled Banneton. If you want to jot it down, I gave you, you can take notes. Baneton, Banneton. So to prep my basket, I always just put a little additional flour in there. And then I'm going to turn it out on this bowl. And you're just tapping around like this, just to get it to coat around the basket. For those who are concerned about gluten-free, depending on how sensitive you are, this is what I had done with the bread I brought to the office. And I found that because most of the flour's been also sitting here for a while, so it begins to ferment eventually. So the fermentation is what changes the wheat so that more people can tolerate it. So I'm not too concerned about it, partly because mine is not celiac disease. If you knew someone who was strictly celiac, you might not want to do this, or you would want to put gluten-free flour in your basket, because you could do that too. So you just kind of make sure it goes around there. There'll be excess, and I just gently tap it because I don't want too much of it to come off, right? I want it kind of a heavy coat. And I'll set that. Eventually it just will, yeah. So the first, like I was explaining, that the first time I did this, I spritzed it with water a little bit to get it to stick. And then after that, it's like a patina on a pan that you've been used for a while. And then after that, it will stick. I don't ever wash it with water, and I don't add water or oil anymore now. I don't have to, but if I ever really wanted to clean this out, the only thing I would do is just take a brush and brush out, and then leave it. And as long as it, doesn't smell sour or look moldy or anything like that, plus you're gonna bake the bread, and this whole process of baking sourdough is fermenting anyway. So now the basket's ready to go. I'll set this here, and right in here I have dough this is half of a batch, and I had this in the fridge last night, and we'll talk about that too. But one of the beauties of being able to shape your dough and time how you bake it is using the fridge, because the sourdough, once it starts to rise and it's good and active, it's very hardy, so it tolerates refrigerator temperatures very well. Which means if you want a time when you're going to bake it, you can use the fridge as a cheat. So this dough I started yesterday morning. Now it's 24 hours and I haven't baked it yet. I started this actually went home for lunch and did this about noon. And then I shaped it late last night into this one here I'm going to bake. Put this one in the fridge, and there it sat until this morning. I pulled it out to kind of bring it to room temperature. So I'm going to go in and out of the camera here just so I can grab from you this. This is one of the ways I'm going to use it to shape my dough on, just to show you. This is one of those silicone baking mats. I picked this one up at Fry's. That's where I get everything. And you want to make sure if you're going to bake on it, because I'll show you that you can bake on this if you don't want to get or don't have a baking stone. Baking stone is what I always use for my freeform loaf. You could get one of these and just make sure it's oven safe to 450, because 450 is the temperature you're going to start your bread at all the time. So anyway, other than that, the silicone mat is great for shaping dough. And you can see there's a little bit of flour in here because I do sometimes need to add a little extra flour if the dough is sticky. Who's baked bread before in here? So you're comfortable with what bread dough is supposed to feel like. It's kind of the same thing with sourdough. Generally with sourdough, when you shape it, you want it to be a little stickier than typical other breads that you make. So I'm just gonna kind of fold this over on itself a few times. Thank you. Like this. And I really just grab it, take it to the middle and kind of push it around. And if you want to feel it, you can, because it's nice and tense. Just pass that around and feel it and squeeze it. It really has, even though it's a slow ferment, long rise bread, it really has a lot of elasticity to it. And yeah, it's dense. Thank you. So what I do is, on the banneton, in the banneton basket, see it's kind of rough on this side, and then it gets smoother on one side. So if I were just to keep working this for a minute, and sometimes for the shaping, it's good just to make sure that you have, you know, as consistent a crumb as possible, just to get the extra bubbles out. And then it's really smooth on one side, not so much the other, which is okay, because then what I'm going to do, if you want to seal this side, what I usually do is I'll put it on I have some of those plastic cutting mats too that I use, and I just turn it on there and it'll seal itself on the bottom and get more smooth if you just keep that up for a minute, right? Anyway, other than that, when I put this in the basket, keep in mind this is not the one we're baking right now. This is one that's going to go in the basket and rise some more. And even though this has been 24 hours, it will rise again still for me before I bake it, because the sourdough is pretty hardy. So which side am I going to put this in on in the basket? I'm going to flip it over. And why would that be?
Because it's the smoothest side and it's going to be the prettiest.
Exactly, because when I flip it back out later to bake it, it's going to go upside down, and so you want the rough side to end up on the bottom. Although by the time it rises, it's really not going to be that rough because it's going to stretch. A lot of times what I'll use, I started buying, plastic wrap and all that stuff, but grocery bags, just flip that grocery bag right over there. And now in about 3 hours, because the second rise is quite a bit shorter, about 3 hours, this will about double, and I'll be ready to bake it. Okay? So we've had.
You want me to move those out?
No, it's okay. Thank you. So that's the use of that. I have a baking stone in the oven. This is the one I shaped. So this is double. This is where it started after I shaped it, just so you can see the difference in size. Okay, so it'll get almost, for the batch size I'm showing you, almost to the top. This one is at room temperature, so it's going to be on the soft side. Sometimes for a free form, I try to time this where maybe only the last hour that it rises, I get it out of the fridge. Because when it starts cold, it tends to not spread as much and will rise better for you in the oven, and you'll get a rounder shape. Little cheat there. So I'll show you what I do to bake this. Put this back in here. Grocery bags. Okay, the oven mitt was right here, and a knife.
What size do you need?
Just this little one will be good, probably. That's probably perfect. Because what I'm gonna do, when you get ready to bake your bread, if you decided to bake it in a loaf pan, I would get something like this. For a large loaf of, for a large batch, you'd probably be baking in 2 of these. This is larger than the standard loaf pan, right? So what you're gonna want, it's a little bit bigger. So they have some, you don't wanna get the one that you'd bake like banana bread in, a little loaf of banana bread. You want a loaf pan that's a little bit larger. Some of you might have stoneware from Pampered Chef, or some of those would be good. The covered bakers are also good. I'll explain why. Nice thing about this loaf pan is you can either bake in it, or if you don't have a Banneton or you don't want to get one, you can do exactly what I did with the Banneton in this pan and invert it. Yeah, you would just want a little bit light coat of oil, flour that pan just the same way I did with the basket, and you can flip it. And then you're gonna get a different shape. So you can kind of modify the shape of your freeform depending on what you let it rise in. If I was gonna bake, if I had put the the bread in here, the dough, and I was ready to bake it, I'm gonna be making slashes across the top of the dough. So I'm not gonna do it here because I'm gonna turn it over and I want those slashes on the top. But I would make cuts. So just a couple of them. Sometimes if you put a little flour on your blade just to keep it from sticking. If you do a cross like this, like an X, that's gonna encourage your loaf to be a little bit more rounded. If you do 3 this way, like they do on French bread, that helps it grow a little bit longer, right? So where you make the cuts can kind of help you manipulate your shape. So I'm gonna pull the oven out. I have the baking stone already in the oven. You want it hot with the oven. My baking stone is almost always in my oven because bread is what I do most in my oven. I don't know about you guys, but I use, everything else for cooking everything else. So I'm gonna show you, hopefully you can see from here, if I pull this out, pull out the rack, okay, and then, Lisa, do you have a small oven-safe dish that I can put water in here?
Yes.
Okay, so you're just like a custard cup size.
Okay.
So you can see how that just came out like that. And now I'm gonna quickly just make a couple of slashes like this in the top of there. Push it back in the oven. And the oven temperature right now is on 450. I'm gonna leave it there for 10 minutes. It's gonna stay on 450 for 10 minutes. And then I'll turn it back to 400. So if somebody wants to help me watch for 10 minutes.
I'll set the timer.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm also gonna put a cup of water in here. Okay, so any guesses on what the water in the oven does?
Keep it moisture in there and builds the crust.
It helps.
Crust?
Yep. So when you have a little moisture in the oven, your crust can expand a little bit more without breaking so much. But also that little bit of moisture in the oven. And sometimes usually a lot of times, we'll put the custard cup of water in there as the oven's heating too. So you could go either way. Or sometimes I'll put it in there with ice cubes in it because they let off steam really quick. But when you have moisture in the oven, it encourages that thin crust. So you get a nice chewy bread with the thin crust. One of my favorite things about the true sourdough bread baking is that you end up with that cracker on the outside of the bread. That's what I like to call it. And it's nice and crispy, but it's not chewy, and it's just different, isn't it, than store-bought bread. So I'll set this back here. Okay, so we have one in the oven, and I've showed you how to shape it. And this was, you could even shape it in here if you wanted and turn it over, but that would be kind of an odd shape, right? You want something that's a little bit straighter. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you about, do you want to see making a batch first, and then we'll talk about care of your starter after that? Would that be okay? I'm going to, let's see, if I get this open here. Oh, it's still filming. Perfect. I'm still on camera. Jars of starter are right there, and I have, we'll get to that in a second. And then I have mine that was large right here. Okay. Because I'm going to need to weigh some of this to make a batch bread. All right. Move this over here. You can bake it in the loaf pan, and the reason I suggested, that's a good question, the reason I suggested maybe one of these are cheaper. This, I have put this straight on the oven rack and baked on it too.
Not on a sheet pan.
Correct. That's why you need one that's 400, safe to 450. Okay. If you use one of these, the nice thing about a stone is it encourages the crust on the bottom, and it gets a lot of heat, but it evenly cooks the crust on the bottom. With this, you know what I did once was I put a dish of water on the rack underneath, which is fine because a lot of time that's what I do. But because it kind of clouded, one side of my crust on the bottom didn't brown because I had the pan under there that kind of blocked it. So you're gonna get the most even heating and the even baking with your baking stone if you want to do freeform. But this will also work. Just be careful that nothing is, blocking the element underneath. It's still cooked. It just wasn't as brown. It wasn't evenly browned on the bottom. So this is a great way to do that too. All right. So I'm going to show you baking a batch of bread. And your starter jar, I'm going to pass this actually around and let you smell it. What a good starter smells like. You can imagine how my car smelled on the way over here with 8 jars of starter.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so I have recently decided that the best way, when I keep a starter out, like I want this one active, I put a towel on here instead of a lid, because it needs air circulation while you're activating it. And if it's in the feeding phase and the activating phase, it needs towel, the air circulation. So to keep dust and heaven forbid little critters, bugs or whatever, from your kitchen out of there, I like a little bit of towel with the ring. One thing to be careful about with the metal ring is sourdough starter, and it's no surprise from smelling it, it's pretty acidic. And that's where it gets its flavor. So, vinegar is one step past wine, right? Well, sourdough starter is pretty much alcohol because of the fermentation, and it is acidic. So whatever you do, always keep your starter in glass, because it's not affected by. My sister had a ceramic thing that my nephew had made for her at school, and I don't know if it didn't have food safe glaze in it or what, but she tried to keep her starter in there, and she said, oh my gosh, she calls me, what's wrong with my starter? I couldn't get it going, and it smells nasty. I said, what'd you put it in? She said, oh, well, Jared made this thing at school. I'm like, that's it. That's what it is. It ate the glaze. So always glass. You need the air circulation. So when you have it out, putting a little piece of towel, I just cut a towel apart and put that on there with the metal ring just to keep it in there. Doesn't even need to be tight, just enough to hold it on there, okay? So that's your starter. When it goes in the fridge, feel free to cover it with something else, but I would put something like wax paper or something under the ring, not the metal lid, because believe it or not, your starter jar will get messy around the edge as you're using it. And I put a lid on there once and it rusted it. Yeah, and then of course you don't want that in your starter. So towel under the lid with that on there to keep it smelling fresh so it doesn't pick up stuff in the fridge. When it's in the fridge, you can have it sealed, okay? But just be careful what you put on there. Not plastic either. Plastic doesn't like sourdough starter. Okay, so let's talk about measurement I have a metric scale. I would like to go back and get another one. I mean, this is great, but it's hard to read my display unless I'm measuring with a glass bowl and I can kind of see through. So what I'm gonna show you is there anyone who's gonna try and bake today? No? Okay, that's fine, because I'll show you. I'm gonna make another big batch then, that's what I'm gonna show you. And so, stainless steel bowl, the reason for that, okay, and I see some of you bought exactly this is great. I was nervous about stainless steel at first because you shouldn't put your starter in metal either, but that's because it's so concentrated, okay? Once it starts you can see the finish, could wash this better, but the finish of my bowl is still just perfect. You couldn't do aluminum, you wouldn't want to do plastic. I did have a stoneware ceramic with a food safe glaze that I used to make bread in for a while. That was also good. No plastic, okay, and no aluminum for the same reasons. So I'm gonna set this here, and the first thing I'm gonna measure according to recipe is 1,000 grams of flour. Weight for bread baking. How do you measure flour when you make bread? You have recipes that calls for cups or? The reason for, my dad taught me a long time ago, the reason for weight is sometimes your flour has a different amount of moisture in it, and so when you measure, it keeps it a little more exact. Although I'm also going to tell you, you don't have to be entirely exact. It depends on the texture that you want your dough. And there's always going to be some variability, so that's why you use the way it feels and the way it looks even after you measure it. So this is, I got this scale, and it has different units that you can just press and change the unit on the bowl or on the display. So I'm going to set it here, and I want it on grams. There, it's on grams. So I'm going to measure in this glass bowl. This is just like one I have at home, Lisa. And the first thing I measure is my flour. Do you have a measuring cup handy, Lisa?
Yeah, in the cupboard behind. Well, of course, mine's in the cupboard behind you.
Okay, right up here?
Let's go here, no, straight up this way. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Sit down. Nino's gonna get you.
Okay, so I'm not measuring by cups, but I want to use one as a scoop. So I'm going to use 1,000 grams, and I'm going to be generous with that 1,000.
Let's go bye.
I want 1,000 grams of flour for this large batch of bread. And I'm just watching the number. One thing I did when you didn't see, and when you get a metric scale, there's a button on it that's called tare. So you put the bowl on there and you zero it again to measure your flour, right? That's what I did. So I'm getting 1,000 grams of flour.
How many cups is that each?
Oh, it's different. I'm not even counting it, but it's probably, I would say it's about 10.
Yeah, it's a lot flat.
Yeah.
Because you're doing the double.
Because I'm doing the
Yeah.
double. So I'm going to get 2 loaves out of this that are about 1.5 pounds each. And I have a little more than 1,000 grams of flour. I actually have like 1,063, which is fine. Because my starter actually happens to be on the wet side right now. So you're going to notice that when you measure starter by weight, if it's moisture heavy, that's going to affect the moisture of your bread too. Keep in mind also, you want to start, it's easier to measure if it's sticky or dry. It's easier to add and incorporate flour to a sticky dough than it is to go the other way around. That must be for the oven temperature.
Yes.
Oh, and I don't know even how to mess
That was
with your
10
oven.
minutes was up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it needs to go down to 400.
It needs to go down to 400. Yep. Okay, so 1,000 grams of flour in here. Okay.
And how long for cooking?
I'm gonna watch it. It's gonna be about 30 minutes probably.
Okay, well, I'll put 30 in.
Okay. I will know by smelling it. Okay, so now what we want is about 50 grams of sea salt. Got this for the large batch. This is all on the chart there. I have 3 batch sizes. Yeah, 50
So
grams.
it's 50 or is it 20?
50. Oh, 20. Yep, you're sorry. Oil is the one that's 50.
Oh, the oil is 50.
Mhm.
That would be some salty bread.
Yeah, it wouldn't rise very well either.
Nice,
So there's.
like the
Oh
lights
my
on.
gosh! Can we?
Look at that.
Yeah.
Because you said you were going to look at it. I thought, well, I might as well put the light on
That
it so you
looks
can look at it.
beautiful. Fabulous. Okay, so 20 grams of sea salt. Then, okay, we're gonna use, and I want to kind of mix this in with my hands so that everything doesn't go on the salt all at once, and we don't get our oil clumped together. Speaking of oil being clumped together, the thing I want to do is use, I'm going to use this for water. So now it's about 500 grams of water and 50 grams of oil. So just measuring in the same, into the same bowl, about 500 grams of water. You want to pour it in slowly because as it sloshes around, it might affect how your scale is measuring it. Close. Huh, I came so close in this bowl. I've done this a few times. Okay, so 500 grams of water and about 50 grams of oil. Thank you for the avocado oil, Lisa. Avocado oil in bread acts as a preservative and helps keep it a little bit softer. Also, I like avocado oil because there's very little flavor. It doesn't have the flavor that olive oil does. And if you pay attention to stuff like this too, olive oil is not heat tolerant the way avocado oil is, and we're cooking at high temperatures. So they say that olive oil changes, the compounds in it change into something you shouldn't put in your body at a high temperature. So there's 550 water and oil. Put this in here. And then the last thing to measure is the starter.
That's interesting. Mixing in the starter. So is it that whole full jar or something?
Nope. So I'm gonna measure about, now my recipe there says 300 grams of starter, but I would honestly start with about 275, partly because this is a really good active starter now. You can see all the bubbles in there. Okay,
Yeah,
you see the bubbles on the side? That's when it's good and active, and it looks really yeasty on the top, like similar to what rises when you do commercial yeast. No commercial yeast in here though. It's all culture, more similar to yogurt than it is to commercial yeast actually.
I noticed that. No yeast, no baking soda, no baking powder.
Yep. So I'm gonna measure 275 grams because I'm gonna start small, partly because it's wet, partly because it's really active right now, and it's going to rise the bread even a little shy of the 300. I mean, I've been feeding these all week too, right? So that we'd have volume to share. I'm gonna get a different scale so I could read it easier. That's why I took a picture of the other one. No, this is fine. I mean, I'm gonna buy one for my house, but I'm fine for this morning. Okay. All right, then just wipe that off. And you see how much of that it took? A little more, yeah, a little more than half. So generally when you are getting your starter ready at home, like I could even have less than this and still have enough starter to keep going and make bread because you don't need a whole lot of volume. But I could also, because it was good and bubbly, it was more volume than if it had settled a little bit. But generally, when you get ready to make a large batch of bread, you're gonna want your starter volume to be up to where it starts to curve into the neck, right? That's the best way I can tell you. And these are 32-ounce bottles for that reason. So I'll put this back over here. Okay. Oh, come on.
You keep your starter in the refrigerator then until you're ready to use it?
Yep.
And then you take it out ahead of time in order to get to room temperature?
Yep.
So
And-
how long can you have that? Like how long can you store that?
And we'll talk about the starter care
Okay.
after I show you, mixing the batch of bread. So those are all good questions. Where did I put my utensils? Yes, here we go. So, something like this is good. Either a really heavy wooden spoon, it's a nice thick handle because the dough is pretty tits. I like these silicone tips, just make sure it's, pretty firm. And then the nice thing about that is when you have a silicone tip on it, you can scrape pans and things like that too, and also mix your bread. My son's gonna be so happy that I come home with bread dough for him. You mean you're gonna go teach bread? Do I get some? All right, so the other thing is, a word to the wise. Now that I've put this paddle, or my spatula, into my bread dough, I don't want to stick it back in the starter because there's salt and oil in here now, and I don't want that mixed back in the starter because the salt will slow down everything. Okay, so now, see if I just turn it this way a little bit. And I just want to start, just kind of stir this around. People ask me, well, do you have a special mixer? Nope, you don't need it. See what I did there? Need? Oh my gosh, I'm so corny. Okay, so.
I know,
And
when you asked about the bowl and stuff, I thought, I'll just put it in my mixer.
And you could, but you wouldn't want to use very much speed or for very long, because then you'd have something that's tough. Because the starter, the long ferment is actually going to develop the texture for you. That's why there's not much kneading and everything. So you see how it looks kind of rough, okay? And then it's just starting to, it really quickly kind of starts to just get combined and come together. Okay. Now the other thing I like to do at this point is get a scoop of flour out of my bin and have it handy. Because in case I need to add some because it's sticky. That much flour might make the difference between dough that's too sticky or just right. So I generally will just get that out and have it handy. Now, the other nice thing about silicone is it's easy to scrape. Okay. So I want to start just kind of mixing this in with my hands, folding it over. And I'm just grabbing it and flipping it to the center. Oh, thank you. You see how it's sticking to my fingers, so I probably do want that last bit of flour. And then you can flip it over in the bowl, pick some up there. Okay, and then I'll show you the difference that much flour right here makes. So as I said, the starter's a little bit on the wet side right now, which is fine. It just depends on what proportion of flour to water you've been giving it. And I'll talk about that too when we get into the starter care. But it's really the bread dough itself, and the starter is active enough that it would be really difficult to make your bread so heavy it wouldn't rise. So don't worry about that part. A little bit stickier dough is going to give you a chewier, moister crumb in your bread. So I do tend to like it a little bit sticky. That's what that much flour has done to it, but I'm going to still keep kind of incorporating it in for a minute. So a little bit of flour can go a long way. And I'm just kind of flipping it over. I'm going to turn it out on here. I don't often use my counter, but I'm going to just show you on here. And it's starting to get sticky again already on the outside.
The size of the one you started to make that one.
Correct. Yep. Well, what I started with to make the two was this exact size dough right here. And then I split it into two, shaped one, and left one in the fridge. And so that's the one I showed you how to shape it with for baking, and then the other one's in the oven. Okay, so then I can put some more, pick up some of this flour that's still in the bowl. I do most of my kneading right inside the bowl. I hardly ever take it out. And if I do, I'll use a mat or that silicone again. But and it can look, it's like slightly sticky. If I pat it, I can just feel it under there. It's kind of dewy like a baby's bum. That's the way it should feel. And then I have some of this other rough stuff in the bowl, which I could work at a little bit. But I actually don't want to overwork it because I don't want it to become tough or anything. Okay, so now take a look at how much dough is in that bowl. So I did tell you to get a large bowl for a reason though, because when I went last night, late before I went to bed, the dough was up here. From this little thing. It was up to that lip on the bowl.
And that was how many hours?
10. 10 to 12, depending on how warm your kitchen is. And I've even done the first proof in the oven, or in the fridge, excuse me. Like a lot of times, you wouldn't want to put it in there right after you've mixed it, but give an hour resting phase, an hour to hour and a half, and then put it in the fridge. So sometimes I'll do this before I go to work in the morning, and then I'll put it in the fridge, and I let it stay all day, and then I take it out, and it's maybe grown half of what it will total, but by the next morning, it's ready to shape. So the fridge can help you time it. It takes longer for it to get done, but it helps you time it. Okay, any questions about that part? So there's your bread dough. This is gonna get split into 2 bannetons, so I'm gonna have 2 loaves of bread out of this much. It doesn't look like it now, but it will. And then when you start to shape it for your baskets, it actually won't come back down to this size again, not quite. It'll still be a little bit bigger, because it's hard to get all that air out of there. Okay, so then the other thing I do is I'll just take my bag here, and I just,
And that's how it goes in the fridge.
or on the counter to rise. Yep, just like that. You want it covered even if it's rising on the counter so it doesn't dry out on the top. These bags
You
are
could
great.
leave that out on the counter for 10 hours.
Uh-huh. Yep, so I'll probably deal with that late tonight actually.
Can
And
it be
then-
on the counter longer than 10 hours?
Yes, 10 to 12,
Okay.
and then it should either go in the fridge or get shaped.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. So once it's been on the counter for 10 to 12 hours, and let's say it's doubled and you're like, I can't deal with this right now, stick it in the fridge. You don't even have to beat it down. You can beat it down later. If you want to beat it down, that's fine. You can still take it back, come back and shape it later. If you don't want to beat it down, don't. But stick it in the fridge. I know, doesn't that look amazing?
Smells good.
And so, yes, so it can go in the fridge just like that until you're ready to deal with it. And the fridge, honestly, I'm going to tell you, I've had dough that I started as much as 2 days ago before I shaped it. Because when it's in the fridge, it is very forgiving. And when you get it back out, it's still active and it will still rise. I wouldn't take it like 5 days. The other nice thing is depending on how you like the flavor too. If you really enjoy the sourdough flavor, that extra day is really just gonna intensify the flavor a little bit more. So I happen to love the sourdough flavor. You're gonna find with the flour, I use mine frequently enough that it doesn't taste super sour. So we're gonna talk about the starter here real quick. Let me just rinse off my hands. And everybody, if you want to, grab a jar of starter right there, and we'll talk about starter here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I didn't know, I was walking around.
And Diane, can you grab hers?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll talk about the starter. All right. Looks like Lisa went and bought the flour that I had suggested, which I'll explain why I suggested certain flour. Okay. There are different flours, brands that you can get. This is one right here that I found at Walmart. And I wasn't looking at Walmart, but one night I was there. I mean, I wasn't looking for flour, but I saw this and I thought, oh my gosh, I can use this for bread. It is all-purpose flour, which a lot of people won't use for bread baking, but because it's a high-quality flour and it's high protein because of the way it's made, it still works for bread. You can get artisan bread flour or bread flour. Honestly, I would go for something like this over like gold medal bread flour. Because when you read the label on your flour, one of the things for health that I started with was the fact that you shouldn't use additives in your flour. So you don't want bromates or anything like that. Those additives are also not good for your starter, for the life of your starter. And they're not good for your glandular system and everything else. So part of the reason this whole journey of sourdough bread baking for me was health. Some of you know that. And my doctor had said, you know, you don't want those additives for your glands. And then when she said you should go without gluten, she said some of that is because modern flour is also not good for you, for the additives that are in it. So this is non-GMO, which means that this is wheat from seed that's over 100 years old. So it's not been modified. It's like, you know, and there are some people who say that a lot of the reason we're needing to be gluten-free as often as we are now is because the wheat has changed. So I like the fact that this is older, okay? So this is non-GMO flour. It's high protein, so there's, what, 5 grams of protein. Some of them you'll see are only 3 or 4. This one is at least 5 grams of protein for a serving. The protein is what helps the bread develop. You can get, like, Bob's Red Mill has some good flour. At our Fry's, there's the Simple Truth Organic, which is pretty good. So you want a high quality flour. That's gonna be, yeah, perfect. All right, just watch it.
And I set the timer for 30.
Thank you. I'm just being a little self-conscious. So here we go. Flour. And I've used Simple Truth Organic all-purpose flour, and it's been great. But I like non-GMO organic. And then for the reasons that we want to reduce gluten, it's just safer, better flour. All right, so I have this scoop you notice I had in my flour bin. I keep it in my flour bin all the time now because a lot of times, like I showed you, that's enough flour to make the difference between wet dough and drier dough, but also that's how much I feed.
Oh, little containers from
Protein powders.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
It just
reminded me of the protein powder.
And so I brought, look at how many I had.
Nice.
I have some, I'll give you one. So what I do, some of these are a little bit smaller, and honestly, that doesn't matter. You can do, I mean, there's a little bit size difference between this one to this one. But honestly, what matters more is the proportion that you're feeding it. So you could even do, if you had one this size, you could do 2 flour and 1 water for your feed. Okay. Generally speaking, when you feed your starter, you want to go with a little bit more flour than you do water, so it's a little bit thick. That helps you see when it's good and bubbly. If it's too thick, you'll actually see your starter expand past. Oh, I've had it overflow my jar.
So we're gonna feed this?
You're gonna feed that. You're gonna take it home. You're gonna be feeding it.
Loving it.
That starter that you have there is, wow, those have grown from this morning. I put them in the jar. Okay, look at the front of your jar where it says Mason, okay? When I filled those this morning, it was just underneath the word Mason, and I gave it a feed, and then from 1 scoop of flour, and it expands a little bit because it's nice and active and bubbly. So it's been fed this morning. Okay. You do not have to feed it when you get it home until tonight. Feeds are twice a day while you're trying to get it activated for bread. You could even do 3 times a day if you want to get your volume up quicker. What I've noticed is if you feed it 3 times a day, it might get active quicker, but the flavor might not be quite as strong because there hasn't been as much time for it to ferment. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How long can it be
Without a feed?
Yeah.
I've forgotten to feed it before at night or the morning, and it's been fine. But past 24 hours, I don't know for sure. So if you forget to feed it one night, but it's not the end of the world, don't toss it. It's probably still fine. Give it another feed. But generally, you want to do it twice a day, as long as you're getting it ready for bread.
When you're not?
Feeding it is 2 flours, 1 water?
Generally, yep.
When you're not getting it ready for bread and you're just maintaining, how often do you feed
If
it?
it's just in the fridge, when you're not using it to make bread, you don't have to feed it.
Oh, okay.
The fridge will keep it dormant.
Okay.
It kind of sleeps.
Okay, so when you're feeding it, you're pulling it out and leaving it out and feeding it?
Yep.
Okay.
When you're getting it ready, okay, so for example, when I started to get my starter ready for this class, pulled it out of the fridge, started feeding it, fed it in the morning, fed it at night, fed it in the morning, fed it at night. Of course, I did it for a few days because I was building bulk.
After you feed it, you put it back in the fridge or it stays?
Nope. When you're gonna bake bread, it stays out on the counter until you make your bread. Okay. So from the volume that you have right now, you could feed it tonight, tomorrow morning, and then tomorrow night you could be making bread. It probably only needs 2, max 3 feeds in order to come up to volume to make a large batch. So that's generally the amount that I have on reserve that you have right now. That's what I have in my fridge all the time. So right now your starter is up to what mine stays at until I'm using it. So you've got a good volume of starter.
So if you know you're gonna make bread 2 days from now, that's when you take it out and start feeding.
Or a day and a half. Day and a half to get 3 feeds. Then you're gonna
It's on
make a
the
large
counter
batch.
when it's
Yep. Room temperature when you're getting it activated.
okay. And then I'm sorry, I missed. How long can it sit in the fridge?
Forever.
Yeah. My dad's had one for 27 years.
That it can just stay in there until.
Now, ideally, I use mine weekly. I asked my dad, you know, how often are you making bread these days? And he said, well, you know, I mean, sometimes. He says, I had one during that period that my kitchen was all torn apart and I wasn't making bread for a while. This was a couple of months. Yeah, a couple of months. And maybe even 3. And there was no way I was making bread. I just didn't have the space for it or anything. So my starter sat all that time. And I was nervous that it wouldn't get going. But it did. So I gave it a first feed or 2, and it slowly, so what I ended up doing was pouring some of it off to get the starter down, because then I had a greater feed to the proportion of, or like more fresh food to old stuff. And it totally revived. So this is from that time.
So now that'll go back, and the one that you used today, that'll go back into the fridge until you're ready to start feeding again.
Yep, because now I have a batch of bread that I've just made, so I'm going to put that in the fridge at home, right?
Weird.
And so I would also want to take, remember I talked about the lid? Okay. So I'm going to take something out of here, and I'm going to pass the bag down, and you can take a scoop. Okay. So I would, if you want to put the lid on, that's fine, but keep the towel under it, just to kind of protect it. Okay, and then that's how I'll put it in the fridge.
How do we mix the feed in? Do we swirl it? Do we stir it? Do we dump it and just let it
Gonna
do its
show you
thing?
that too.
Okay.
Yep. So I'll put this back over here. Okay, well, you know what? Why don't I feed mine and show you? I'll feed this one. All right, so when I'm gonna feed it like this, I'll get, where's my, oh, okay, right here. A lot of times, sometimes I actually have 2 of these scoops. You know, you don't have to, but I have 1 for water, so I don't put it back in there. So I would put 1 scoop of water in there. This little cup is probably a little more than 1/4 a cup if you don't have something like this, but that's probably about how much it is. So I put 1 of water in, and then I can either do, you know, like 2 lightly packed level, or sometimes I'll just do like, you know, like that and dump that and call it good. It's not always 2. It's not always a complete 2, because, and you'll know, I mean, if your starter starts looking really thick like snot, you know, you might want to go easy on your next feed. So I'm going to go ahead and put 1 and like 1/2 in here right now. Okay, and that's probably perfect. Then I have this utensil here, something like this, silicone, or it's not going to stay in there all the time, probably not metal, I don't know, a whisk. But all I do is I just stick the fork in there. Part of the reason I put water in first is it does tend to be easier for me to stir it up if I've put the water in first. And I just
So it just needs to be non-metal, or
yeah, well, anything that's going to stay in there for any length of time. But like your food safe plastic, silicone is perfect because, you know, or a wooden spoon.
okay.
And you just beat that up, and you can kind of see the texture of that. See? Little like oatmeal. And it's been really working hard the last. So, and then I just scrape it off. I try and beat it off. You can scrape it off on the edge of your jar. You're gonna find the edge of your jar starts getting like messy with dried starter on it. That's fine. Once in a while, you can just grab a new mason jar and switch them out. Put it in a new jar. Like that. And that's pretty much all there is to it, like that. So now I've fed it. That's 1 feed. So if I was gonna make bread tonight, I don't have quite quite enough volume to make bread tonight, but if I wanted to make bread and share with my neighbor, I could give that a couple more feeds. So right now it's at the volume where probably 3 feeds would get me to a large batch with some left over.
Could you use that now to make?
I could use this now and make sourdough pancakes. I could do, yeah, I could use this much now because, you know, I have another starter, but you always want to plan it so you have your reserve.
But if you didn't need any reserve, you could right now use all of that.
Yes, I could, and make a batch of bread. Yep, this is enough to probably do the medium size. Yeah, sourdough pancakes. Okay, so this is where things get really fun. I'll just mention this. It's not on your sheet. And if you ever want to know more about this, I'll be happy to tell you again. But I missed pancakes. And I miss bagels. I've got to find a way to make bagels with my sourdough starter, which I'm going to do. And we'll share. So I really wanted pancakes. I thought there's got to be a way to make... Well, for me, okay, with the gluten issue, here's the thing. For those of you who avoid gluten, I've done a lot of research on why sourdough works for people who are gluten sensitive. So now that we've talked about your sourdough starter care, I'll kind of go into that if you want to talk about some of that stuff. Any questions about use of your starter? Your directions are all on there. So remember, when you're not getting it ready for a batch of bread, it's in the fridge. About a day and a half of when you want to bake the bread is when you take it out and start feeding it, depending on your size. 2 feeds a day. Usually 3 feeds will get it up to the volume that you want.
This will, as it is right now, last in the refrigerator for 27 years.
Well, you have to, yeah, you have to use it, right?
Ish.
Right. My dad has had periods, he said, where he wasn't using it, but then he'd pull it out, and sometimes he said, and once in a while. Okay, so now let's talk about, this is a good question. If you have it in the fridge for a couple weeks, or even a week, it'll start to separate. So if you start seeing a layer of liquid on there, don't be alarmed, that's normal. There's a name for that liquid, it's called the hooch. I love that. It's called hoochie. So I'm a hoochie mama, right? I am totally a hoochie mama. It's called the hooch, okay? And I believe I made notes on here about the hooch and what's normal. When the hooch on mine during that, 3 months where my kitchen was torn apart and everything, and I didn't use it at all. The hooch turned like gray, like deep gray, like the cloudy sky, like a storm was coming. And it's normal. As long as it's not orange or pink. Because that's a bacteria you don't want. Same as pink mildew in your bathroom. It's the same kind of thing. So if it's orange or pink, toss it. Don't even start another one, get another one for me if something happens. I've never had it happen. But I know that if it's orange or pink, it's poison. You shouldn't use it. Anything from yellow to green to gray, you're good. It still can be used. There's different... people approach the hooch differently. I like it because it's flavor. So you can sometimes pour the hooch off before you take it out. Pour that liquidy layer off if you don't like the smell of it or if it's too strong. You can pour that off. But usually I mix it back in. And usually mine hasn't sat long enough to get that much of a layer on it. So it's always regenerating. There's some replacement and refresh because you put new in, you pour some out, you put new in. So over time, this is a different set of flour than when I started. But the culture is still there. The culture is closer to yogurt than it is to commercial yeast. Okay, any questions about that? All right, sourdough pancakes. So I wanted to make sourdough pancakes. So based on everything I've read and what I know about gluten and why I can tolerate this, it's the long ferment that alters the gluten. So I can't say this is gluten-free bread, but it's gluten modified. In my case, with celiac, I don't have celiac. But I have a friend who has celiac, and she has it,
That's the 30 minutes.
and it looks about ready to come out too. So let's hold this thought on the sourdough pancakes, and I'll show you pulling this out of the oven.
What do you want to sit that on?
I'm going to show you right now what I do. See this board? Okay. So I have a board like this that I use to get it out of the oven off the oven stone, off the baking stone. So I just get a mat like this. And open the oven. Oh my gosh.
That smells so good.
Oh yeah, look at that.
It's beautiful.
So all I do is I slide this off and I kind of catch it on the board. And that's how I get it out of the oven.
Should I
Super
turn the oven
simple.
off?
Yep.
Okay. That way your stone can cool down.
So sometimes the texture of this one was a little bit softer, so it didn't necessarily spread, but you can see where I made the cuts, and sometimes it'll spread a lot and crack. The reason for the cuts is so that it doesn't break and look really ugly. You have to give it a release point. That's really what the slices are for. It's called slashing your dough. Okay, and I mean, just look at that. I want to cut it right now.
And is this one the 2 pound?
This was half of a 2 pound.
Okay.
So the 2 pound makes 2 of these.
Okay.
Okay. Or you can see why I say the small loaf pan would not work.
Right.
This would not fit in a small loaf pan. If you wanted to get loaf pans and use 2 loaf pans from that large loaf, you have to use the really large loaf pans. Because that's about as much as a full, like, French loaf, right? It's about 1.5 pounds, close to 2 maybe, of bread. Okay? So I'll set this right here. We can cut this and have some butter on that in a minute. Okay, so then it gets fun with things like sourdough pancakes. So anyway, I was talking about gluten. And what happens with the long ferment is there's a combination of amino acids in flour. It's a protein. The gluten, and there's 2 proteins in wheat. Gluten and gliadin. Yeah, not gliadin. Gluten and
It's a G.
yeah, it is. I thought it was gliadin, but anyway. So of the 2 proteins, gluten, of course, is the one that gives us trouble. And the gluten protein gives me trouble, not because of celiac, but because I have an autoimmune called Hashimoto's disease. And the thyroid hormone, the reason I got into this, is the protein structure in the thyroid globulin is so close to the thyroid, or to the protein structure in wheat, that if I eat wheat, gluten, it trips my body into the same attack as my natural hormone does. Okay? So I thought, well, I was watching a program one night called Cooked. Michael Pollan wrote a book and it's on Netflix. I highly recommend it. But one of his segments was on fermented foods. And they were talking about sourdough bread. And he showed this baker who does this, and he has like a cellar that he lets it rise in, and showed us freeform loaves. And he was talking all about this. And then they start talking about celiac and gluten sensitivity. And of course, my ears perk up because I miss bread at this point. And so he starts to talk about how the Celiac Foundation even has anecdotal evidence, and they're starting to look at the fact that many people with celiac are reporting that they can tolerate true sourdough bread. When I say true sourdough bread, if you're shopping for sourdough bread and it says yeast, don't buy it. Gliadin, I was right, okay. Don't buy it if it says yeast, because this actually has no yeast. If it says yeast, they've done something, it's not a long ferment. They've put yeast in there to speed it up. The beauty of the long ferment and true sourdough bread is what happens is the cultures in the sourdough starter eat the proteins and some of the starches. So when you get to sourdough bread like this, you've reduced the glycemic load. True sourdough bread has a lower glycemic load than regular white bread. And you've altered the protein because the amino acids, 2 of the main amino acids most plentiful in gluten, are arginine and lysine. Arginine is the highest one. Arginine happens to also be an irritant to people with herpes, for example. So if you eat wheat, they don't eat wheat because the arginine will send them into a flare-up. The cultures happen to really dig arginine. So as it has time to sit with the culture, a lot of that arginine is being literally eaten by what's in the culture instead of your body. So it simplifies the protein, it breaks it down, and so the amino acid profile of wheat after sourdough processing is different. So it's no longer the same in my system as if I just bought a loaf of Wonder Bread. So I thought, well, I'm going to try it. I'm just going to try it. And because I have a specific antibody I'm supposed to look at and see if it goes lower. When I started with Hashimoto's disease 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, long story there, but the doctor said, well, okay, let's look at it and let's see. So the index of this specific antibody is 60 and normal. 60 and below is normal in the body. Mine was 2,572. So my doctor said, you really have to go without gluten. I had been kind of trying to avoid it, but I'd not gone gluten-free. So I took her at her word. So there's where I started not eating gluten. So by the time I started learning about sourdough bread, I was desperate because gluten-free bread tastes nasty. And it's so processed when you look at the label, what they have to do to it to make it turn into bread is, why would I want to put that in me anyway? So I took a chance. I was starting to feel better. I thought, you know what? It's not like I'm going to become immediately sick as if I had celiac disease, so I'm going to try it, and I'm going to monitor my antibody and see what happens. So I eat my own bread routinely. I don't eat other gluten, pasta, whatever, but this gives me sanity because I can have bread, and I can have real bread. Because it's lower on my glycemic load, when I eat it, it doesn't leave me craving more. Like, I don't feel like I'm going carb crazy to eat some.
And on that note, with the recipe, with the directions, there was no sugar added. I used to make 3 loaves of bread a week before my diagnosis. They all have sugar added to them. No sugar.
Yeah, because you don't need it to feed. It
Yep.
feeds on the wheat.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. So I thought, well, I'm just going to try it. So I started making the bread. Watch my antibodies. My antibodies at my last test, remember they were 2,572. I have it down to 232 now.
Wow.
And over the last 2 years, even me eating this bread that I make, it's never gone like up, and it consistently has gone. My doctor says, what are you doing? Well, taking care of myself for one thing, because I do that. But she said, and so she wants, to learn how to make the bread, because, well, it's not, obviously, there's something about the change in the gluten that everything that I read is true, because it's not tripping up my system. And I know from before I had my diagnosis officially, and I'd been trying to kind of stay away from gluten, went home for Thanksgiving, what did I eat? Pie, rolls, whatever my family offered. I came home feeling like hell, and so I know that it makes a difference. Okay, so
What are your symptoms?
everything, if you read about thyroid disease, it affects pretty much every system in your body. And even though, I'll put in a plug here about Hashimoto's too and thyroid disease. I had been asking for about 5 or 6 years, something's wrong. I think it's my thyroid. I would read the symptoms. I know it's thyroid disease, something's wrong. And the doctor, no, you're fine. They would check my numbers, they would do the screening. The antibody that defines Hashimoto's disease is not part of thyroid screening, and it probably should be. Because I flew under the radar for a while. Because what happens is, on paper, it looked like I had an appropriate amount of thyroid hormone in my body. TSH was technically normal. T4, the main hormone that was floating in my blood, was technically normal. But because I had the antibody that we didn't know about, the antibody, once it's in your body on the attack, attaches to the thyroid, not just your gland, but any thyroid hormone that's in your blood is now bound with this antibody, which means that my body was not using my own thyroid hormone. So I had all the symptoms of hypothyroidism for about 5 or 6 years before they could find it. I finally got to a point where my thyroid was hurt, or the gland was hurt enough that I was borderline. So the doctor says, okay, well, I'm like, finally, how long have I been asking for this? So we started me on thyroid pills. Went through that for about 1.5 years. Still not quite getting level, not feeling quite right, making a little progress, but not feeling a whole lot better. I posted something on Facebook. My aunt comes along and says, oh, I know what you're going through. I have Hashimoto's. I said, Hashimoto's, what's that? She tells me, I took that back to the doctor's office because the person I had been seeing had a baby, left, didn't come back. Now there's a new provider. I tell this to her. She says, oh, didn't they test you for that? I said, no. She said, oh, we better. That's when my number came back 2,572. So no wonder I still didn't feel good, even though I had thyroid pills. And they had also put me on Nature-Throid, which then just brought on the antibody even more because it was the natural form. So I had to get off, I had to get on synthetic, and then getting rid of gluten too, to slow down. Because I have to have enough thyroid hormone, but I also have to slow down the immune attack, which is where gluten comes in for me. I have to stay away from gluten because it furthers that immune attack. So, anyway, all organic, flour, water, salt, and oil, that's it. No sugar, no commercial yeast, no nothing, and no additive flour. Pancakes, let's talk about pancakes, and then we'll cut this. Yay! So, I've made bread, and sourdough bread's really good, but man, I would love pancakes. So I was thinking, okay, how could I make pancakes? Well, if you look at the consistency, that's about like pancake batter, right? It's very similar, so I thought, I bet I could do that. So when I make pancakes, I'll get my starter out, I'll put some in a bowl, and I'll add flour and water to it until it looks on the thick side, like too thick to be pancakes. And I do that on purpose, because I'll tell you why. Then I let it sit overnight, because the magic number to alter gluten seems to be at least 8 hours. from what I read as I started researching about this, as long as it sits and has a rise of at least 8 hours, you've altered the gluten to at least some degree. Mine is generally 12 for bread plus another 3 or 4. So we're getting more like 12, 15 hours, 15, 16 hours by the time I bake the bread. But for pancakes, I knew I had to give it at least 8 to 10 hours somehow in order for me to be able to eat them. So I made it thick, let it sit overnight.
On the counter?
Okay. 10 hours, letting it sit on the counter where it will be active and ferment. Come back in the morning, add 1 egg, little milk, baking powder, stir that up. We've all made pancakes. We know what it should look like. Till it look like pancake batter. I put, I think it was about a cup of starter that I used. So I got out a cup of starter. And then I put in about a cup of flour and a little water so it was on the thick side. Then I came back in the morning and added, I think I put buttermilk in them because I wanted that flavor. An egg, some milk, teaspoon of baking powder, stirred it up, come back, 10-15 minutes, sure enough, it's bubbling up, looks just like pancake batter. Made the yummiest pancakes.
Baking powder.
So I had sourdough pancakes. And at that point, after it's fermented, never, 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 never add sugar. I would not have added sugar the night before I went to bed, because then the culture would have eaten the sugar and not changed the flour, right? So for those of you that doesn't matter, you can maybe add sugar, but to keep because if it eats the sugar and dies off quick, then you've hurt the culture too. So in the morning, if you want to add a little sugar at that point, you can for flavor.
Okay, so in the morning you added buttermilk, powder, baking powder, and
An egg.
Dash of salt. Did you say a dash of salt?
Yeah, you could add a pinch of salt in there. A little sugar if you want, or a little honey, a little vanilla. Anything you want to add that now you've already done the work. The culture's already done the work of changing the flour, so you're not hurting that part of it to add whatever else you want at that point. Okay, so sourdough pancakes. That was really fun.
Thank you.
Any questions about starter or anything like that? Should we cut this and see what it looks like inside?
please.
Okay. So here's a starter here. All right, bread knife. Lisa, is there one back here?
Yeah, I think it's the lighter shade colors,
Okay,
and I think it's the one up towards. You just do what you're doing. and you'll
I'll
find it.
find it. Got it.
Until it looks the consistency of the baking.
On that note, Lisa's got this long, beautiful knife. Okay, I'm going to show you. This is a great knife, and a lot of times you find bread knives and they're shorter.
Yeah.
But when you bake like this, you get a loaf that's a little bit wider, so you want to find a good long. Right before I cut this too, I also want to tell you that some other things I bake in. Okay, and I just went to like Goodwill. The handle, I dropped it and it broke off, but I can still use it. I found this at Goodwill. It was hardly used, I sometimes, instead of splitting it in two, I bake the entire batch in here. Okay? Here's what happens when you're baking in a lid. Okay? And the reason I would do this is that this is a nice, it's one giant loaf. But imagine when this comes out of the oven, I shape it in here, let it rise in here the second time, and bake it in here. When it comes out of here, my son loves nothing better than to take one slice off, cut it in half, and that's enough for a sandwich. So this is really good for that. It's also nice if you're doing appetizers. I've cut it into little strips and made like, bruschetta out of it. But this is beautiful too, because afterward, we never have to put the bread in plastic. This is my bread box. So this is, even this one, after we cut it, when I take it home, I'll put it in here, and it's a bread box, and it'll stay like this on the counter. And then I put the lid on there, and it keeps it fresh. It doesn't go stale. So something with a lid like that is good. It's also nice and heavy, so it gives a nice crust, and it gives a nice color all the way around, because it's one of those iron ones, like a Dutch oven. Club brand, Dutch roasting pan is what it's like. The nice thing about this is when I bake in something with a lid, when I do freeform, you notice it went in the oven, there's no lid or anything like that. It was 450 for 10 minutes. When I bake in something like this, and I believe I have separate directions for when you're using a covered pan in there. If I put the dough in here, I oil and flour it when I shape it, okay? And then when I bake in here, it goes in the oven with the lid on. I make slashes in the top, put the lid back on, stick it in the oven. It goes in at 450, and it stays like that for 20 minutes because it's in a heavy pan with the lid on. So when in a covered dish like this, it'll stay at 450 for 20 minutes with the lid on. At 20 minutes, I take the lid off and turn the heat down. Okay? And then it'll finish baking.
So you'll, after the 20 minutes, you go down to 4.
Uh-huh. Partly also because this one, the size, I want the higher temperature for a little bit longer because it's bigger. It's got to bake through, right? So that's what I do with that. So you know what? Don't invest a lot of money. Go to the Goodwill. It almost doesn't matter. Whatever appeals to your eye for the shape and size, you can use it. And again, I have one that's a little bit smaller than this. This cooks the large batch. This size here will cook the large batch. And I'm pretty sure this is close to 8 quarts like those bowls, or maybe 6, okay? When I do the medium size, I have a stoneware that somebody gave me that's a little bit smaller than this, and I'll cook the medium size in a medium stoneware with a lid, okay? And if you have questions, you're looking at something you want to get, I mean, you can always send me a picture and I'll tell you. I'll give you my phone number, and if you're looking for something that you want to bake in, I'll be happy to tell you. I'll give you some feedback on that.
Yeah, okay, what is your number?
480-204-3898.
204-3898.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, so now let's cut this. See what this looks like. Do you have a cutting board that's a little bit bigger so I get fewer crumbs all over?
I don't care about crumbs.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. That'd be perfect. Uh-huh. That's lovely. Okay.
And I have another one.
At home, I have, just talking, for those of you who want to know, I have a large cutting board that I got on Amazon that's for bread, that's made for bread, and it's bamboo like this, but it's 2 pieces. So it has a piece that has slats and it catches the crumbs, but the slats also, you can line it up, and I cut along the slats as a guide. Keeps me visually straight, lets the knife go in without ruining the thing. I should have brought that with me, but you can see I already brought a few items today. So, oh, and look at the bottom.
Beautiful.
See, that's what the baking stone does. It's nice and even, but it's not more brown on the bottom than it is on the top.
Can I take a picture of that?
Yeah. It's a pizza stone. So, and you can find rectangular ones too. I want to get a rectangular one so I could try and bake both at once, side by side. Okay. Places like Sourdough or Williams-Sonoma, you could get a nice baking stone there. Mine I actually found at the Goodwill, and it's been well used and very dark in color. But keep in mind, as I said, I always keep mine in the oven, so when you preheat your oven to bake your bread, the stone is already in there. You want the bread to go on a hot oven, on a hot stone.
Look at that smile.
I love this. It never gets old. Every time I cut this, it's like, oh damn, look what we did. My son is learning how to bake the bread too, same thing. Or the smell. He's 16. He can do this whole thing. Yeah, and the smell when you bake it in your house, it's just, oh man. Okay, so this part right here, this is what, at my house, what we affectionately call the bread bum, the end crust, but look at that. See, that's a mark of rustic bread too, is the uneven holes. You never quite, but I like that, I love that. And then you can see, look how thin the crust is. Even the color where the crust is. It's so thin compared to the rest of the bread. So, we'll cut away. And, oh man, then we'll get some butter and everything, come over here.
She's got butter out.
Yep,
Ready.
and